Well, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in and being a part of our church family with us today. My name's Seth, in case we haven't had the opportunity to meet. And I want to invite you to something special that we're doing next week. We're going to be live streaming our services from our Batesville campus at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. Now, these are not open doors for anybody who wants to come, but we're going to be getting ready for when we reopen the doors at the end of June, and we're so excited for that. And so I hope you can be a part of it because, man, I am ready to get back to normal. How many of you, I'm just curious, how many of you are ready to get back to normal? Anybody? Yeah, I can't see your hands, but I can imagine your hands because, and when I say normal, I mean normal the way it was before the pandemic happened. I'm not sure that that'll come for a while, but when we get things back to normal again, there's something that I am so looking forward to doing, and that is that I love introducing people to the things that I love. I know it's kind of silly, but I am a bit of a raving fan, and if you know me, if you've spent time with my family or my staff, I mean, they'll confirm all this. The people I work with, I love certain things, such as rock shandy, favorite soft drink from Ireland. That's why we do the St. Patrick's Day fun that we do, because I just love Ireland, and I want you to love Ireland too. Or Publix premium ice cream. They have amazing scones. When I travel around, I have pizza places that I love to go to in different states. I like stopping there. A cake, Costco cakes, Publix cakes. In fact, if you like Costco cakes, here's a little tip. They have special ones during the pandemic that are smaller than normal. So, you don't have to feel guilty about eating an entire half sheet, which my family has done before. You can just feel guilty eating a 16-inch cake round. But anyway, those are available in case you want to know. But for me, I just love taking people to experience the things that I love to experience. And there's something joyful about it. It's not enough to just tell other people about the things I love. I want them to come and see for themselves. I want people to come and see for themselves. And that's really what this series is all about, that Dan began talking about last week. And you can probably relate to what I just talked to, because there are probably some things that you love. Now, maybe they're not food related the way that my things are food related, but there are probably some things in your life, whether it's a sports team or a person you're dating or something, and you just can't wait to show and tell others about it. Now, last week when Dan began this, he talked about the importance of investing and inviting. And what he was talking about is really the way that Christianity kind of took off the ground. In fact, what you find when you look at the life of Jesus isn't that there were a bunch of bandwagoners who just jumped on the bandwagon, no questions asked, no doubts, no uncertainties. You see a group of people who were invited to come and see, that Jesus invited them to come and see and experience, and it was when they began experiencing what Jesus invited them to experience that their lives began changing, and that's when they invited other people to come and see too. And that's the reason why Christianity grew, because people came and they saw that their lives were better, and they experienced it, and they didn't want to keep it to themselves. They wanted to tell other people that they could come and see too. And so the reason why we talk about investing and inviting, and frankly, if you've been around our church for any period of time, that's not new terminology for us. We've been talking about this for a long time. The reason why we talk about investing and inviting is the same reason why Christianity grew, because we want people to be able to come and see. We want people to be able to come and experience the life that we have come to experience and know in Jesus, because we believe our lives are better because we came and saw. That as we came and saw, as we experienced Jesus, as we experienced his grace, as we experience his mercy, as we experience his forgiveness, his love, it is so amazing that we want others to be able to experience that as well. In fact, we'd say we want other people to experience Jesus the same way we've experienced him. In fact, as a church, from a leadership standpoint, when the pastors and staff, when we get together, when we talk with our elders, we regularly talk about how do we create come and see environments. How do we create an environment where what we're doing doesn't get in the way, when we present ourselves as authentic, when we have an opportunity to just be real with each other, where kids want to come and see and sometimes even drag their parents, which is something we've been told their kids sometimes do, when we can experience our joys together, our sorrows together, our failures, our insecurities, that this is the most friendly place in the communities where what we teach is understandable, and even if you don't fully get everything, you walk away saying, I think there's something there I can take and I can do something with. We want to create a come and see environment that you're proud to invite other people to, because we know if you're proud to invite other people to it, you'll invite other people to it, right? Because what we have come and known and what we have experienced has changed us in such a good way. And so if you're watching with us today, or if you're listening online, however you're kind of engaging with us, I just want you to know, if someone invited you, the reason they invited you is because they want you to experience the very thing that they have experienced personally. They want you to experience the joy. They want you to experience all that they have come to know. And so today, I mean, my goal, if that's you, my goal isn't to convince you, in anything, but my goal is to help you understand why we're different as a church, because our church is a little bit different. That doesn't mean we're better. It just means we're a little bit different. And I want you to understand why it is that we do what we do, because we want people to be able to come and see. And you may find some of what I say today insightful or helpful. And if that's the case, I hope you'll take something and do something with it. But for those of us who are regulars, who are, part of community church on a regular basis, I want to talk today about why it is that sometimes people accept our invitations to come and see, and why it is that sometimes they don't. Why it is that sometimes people are excited to come and see, and why it is that sometimes they don't really have any interest at all. Now, truthfully speaking, that's a tension that I faced when I was a teenager and as I was a kid, because I invited people to come and see on a regular basis. I was all about, I believed it was so important to share my faith and to tell others about it. I wore Christian t-shirts. I mean, I was all in. I wasn't ashamed. I wanted people to know. But the thing was, people didn't always want to come and see. And it never really, I never understood it. Why was it? It was kind of baffling to me. But as I've gotten older, it's become a little bit clearer to me, and that's because sometimes what they saw in me didn't make them want to come and see more. Because sometimes I wasn't the most loving. Sometimes I wasn't the most humble. Sometimes I wasn't the most gracious or forgiving. Sometimes the reason people don't want to come and see is because of me. That's not always the reason, but sometimes it's the reason, and maybe it's because of you. Because they've come and they've seen and they're not really interested in seeing anymore, and they think, if that's what Christianity is, I'm not sure I want that. Here's my point, and this is what we're going to talk about today. The way we live our lives has an impact on whether or not people around us want to come and see. And I believe Jesus knew that. And I believe he addressed that in a very famous sermon, often referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. Now, here's the thing. The Sermon on the Mount, there's been some discussion about, was it one sermon? Was it multiple sermons? We don't really know for sure. The thing that we know is that Jesus was directing the Sermon on the Mount to people who were considered his insiders, the disciples. That at some point in time, he took the disciples, whether the 12 or a larger group of followers, we're not exactly sure, but he took these people aside and he sat down with them and he began unfolding what the ways of his kingdom would look like, what the values of his kingdom would be like. Now, to kind of pick up where we left off last week, Dan shared how the process of finding disciples came about as Jesus invited people to follow him and to come and see, and there were 5 initially, and at some point in time, that grew. And as people began following him, Jesus took them with him as he traveled, which was very common in this day. He traveled about 60 miles north to a city of Cana where there was a wedding, and he performed his first miracle where he changed water into wine. And then after the wedding, he traveled back down south to Jerusalem, and he actually kind of always go up to Jerusalem because it's geographically higher in altitude than anywhere else. But he went to Jerusalem for Passover, and he overturned tables, and he took a whip and knocked change on the ground and set animals free. I mean, they experienced so much. And then he went around Galilee teaching in synagogues and telling other people about the kingdom. And then we know that at some point in time, he pulled away from the crowds. He pulled away from the people who came from miles and miles around, as Matthew tells us, who wanted to know, who wanted to hear him teach, who wanted to experience his healings. At some point in time, he pulled away. He went up onto a mountainside or hillside, and he began teaching those who were his followers. And in doing so, he taught them the values of the kingdom, the beautiful attitudes, the beatitudes that perhaps you have known or heard about before. If you grew up in a church setting, you've perhaps heard of those. The things that make us different, things like being dependent on God. He talked about how the humble and the merciful, blessed are, or happy are the Beatitudes. The pure in heart, those who have pure motives, blessed are those who are persecuted. I mean, he began unfolding this very new system that was very different than the world around him. And this was what would shape, ultimately, his followers. This is what would shape Christianity. Now, I don't know what it was like to be listening in that sermon, because what they heard was so vastly different than the world around them, the culture around them. And perhaps they didn't exactly know what to do with that. And so I believe Jesus kind of spoke into that, and he gave them an answer. And if you grew up in church, you've heard these verses before, but I want to spend some time really thinking about what Jesus was saying in these verses. And if you didn't grow up, then you don't have any background to it, and that's okay. I think we can jump in and we can begin seeing what it was that Jesus was infusing into his followers as it comes to this whole conversation that we're having about coming and seeing. So here's what he said, Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. He said, "You are the salt of the earth." Now, the earth didn't necessarily refer to the earth. It was figuratively talking about people. The earth was people. And so he said, you are the salt of people. Now, salt, as you probably know, is both a preserving agent and a flavoring agent. But in a day and an age where there wasn't refrigeration, they didn't have ice, salt was used more for preserving. And so what Jesus was essentially saying is that your role is to preserve the world around you. His point was that without the real values of Christianity. Now, I realize that there are times where there have been misuses and abuses of Christianity, things like the Crusades. I look at that. I look at the atrocities done in the name of Jesus, and it's embarrassing. I think about street preachers and their spewed hate as they tell other people that they're going to turn or burn. That's not what Jesus was talking about. But here's his thing. Without the values and the virtues of Christianity, the world is not a better place. That without Christianity, what Jesus was saying is the world spoils. You're the salt of the earth. You are preserving the earth. Christianity preserves like salt. Now, that could come across as arrogant, but I promise you it wasn't meant to. What Jesus was saying is that when the values that he was bringing into the world would make a difference in the world. And the truth is, they have. They have. When you look at the world around us, when you look at the value of women and children, everywhere Christianity has spread, the value of women and children has gone up. Slaves have been set free. I mean, people have been treated with decency. There's been sexual purity and not rape. I mean, the life has been elevated, and it's all because of Christianity. Augustine, he said, we're never to judge a philosophy by its abuse. And so we can't look at the abuses. What we look at is what Jesus proclaimed and what he taught. And his point was that when my values come into the world truly is a better place. Think about what the Apostle Paul taught. The fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. And then when he began laying out these things that become true of us when God's Spirit's living inside of us, he finishes by saying, against such things, there is no law. In other words, no one makes up a law against loving others. No one makes up a law against having self-control and forcing you into indulging. We have laws against those things. Frankly, when we think about the fruit of the Spirit, my guess is there is somebody in your life, whether it's a friend or a coworker or an in-law or a relative, and you just think, man, their life would be better off if they had more self-control, or if they were, more loving, or if they had a little bit more patience. Even honestly, we look at our own lives and we say, the pandemic has really kind of been a fishbowl for us as things in our lives have kind of come to the surface as we've begun to see, it's possible you've been frustrated with people in your family or frustrated with things that you've been experiencing and you've kind of been getting angry, or you've not had a whole lot of self-control, or maybe you haven't been exactly loving or peaceful or patient in the midst of all of this. And so we look at that and we say, yeah, you know what? My life would be better off with those things. My life would be better off. If I gave you the option of saying, this week you can choose to receive love or receive hate from the people around you, which would you choose? We know the answer to that. Or if I say, would you rather have peace this week or anxiety? Which would you choose? Or, what would you want for your kids? Do you want your kids to marry, or your loved ones, or your best friend to marry somebody who lacks self-control, or someone who isn't patient or who isn't kind? Of course not. And so what Jesus was saying is, look, as I teach my ways and as you begin putting those into practice, it's going to be like salt and it's going to preserve the world around you. Now, let me ask you a question. Can you relate to that? Do you know someone who didn't just talk the talk but walked the walk? And I don't mean to be cliche in my use of that phrase. I mean, maybe you looked at them and their life was a little bit Victorian, their values and their morals. You're just thinking, does anybody live that way anymore? I mean, really, it's the 21st century. We're living in 2020. Who does that? Or the way that they operated their business, that they were always upright and honest and they had integrity and they never fudged numbers and they never manipulated or were dishonest. Or the way they lived with their family and they ate meals together, right? And it's kind of like the Cleavers, if you're familiar with Leave It to Beaver, right? From a long time ago. And you look at them and you're like, they're just a bunch of goody-goodies. And yet there was something about the way they lived their lives that lended to their credibility. And you began looking at them, and when things kind of fell apart, they were the people you went to. Not because they acted like they were better, but because they were there and they cared for you and they listened to you and maybe they helped to preserve something in you. Maybe they helped preserve your marriage or a relationship. Maybe they helped preserve your kids or even your job or your purity. I don't know what it was, but listen, there was something different about them that preserved something good in you. And I believe what Jesus was saying is that wherever we are, whether it's in our neighborhood, whether it's in work, at school, in Zoom meetings, we are there, his followers, because remember, this was directed to his followers. His followers are there to help preserve the world around us, that the world is better. The world is better when his kingdom values come into play. Now, you may wonder, is my life even making a difference? Does anybody see? I look at the world around me. It doesn't seem to matter that my kingdom values are being lived out by me. But the truth is, salt works even when you don't see it. So Jesus, he continued on. He said, you're the salt of the earth. And then he said something that was a little bit confusing. I'm going to explain it. He said this, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Now that phrase, loses its saltiness, is actually one Greek word, and it really means to be made foolish. If salt becomes foolish, if it becomes foolish, then it's useless, essentially what he is saying. Now, salt in this day and age came from salt marshes, and because it was in a salt marsh, there were impurities that came along with it. And what would happen, because sodium chloride is more water soluble than the other impurities, is that in a high humid climate, the salt would actually dissolve away, and what you would be left with wasn't salt. You just have this substance that wouldn't be good for rubbing on your food. It wouldn't be good for preserving anything. And so what do you do when the thing that you have to preserve isn't going to preserve? He says this, he says it's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You can't re-salt it. See, the only way to keep preserving is by holding on to what allows you to preserve in the first place. Now, Jesus said this 2,000 years ago, and again, he was saying it to his followers, but I really believe it applies to his followers here today, and here's what I believe he was getting at, and that's that how we live matters. The way we treat other people matters. The way we raise our kids, the way we honor people, the way we show that we value others, the way we live out our morality and our purity. And if we're not careful, we can lose our influence. And the truth is, lost influence is incredibly difficult to regain. It's kind of like trust. How do you regain trust when it's lost? You teenagers, or those of you who are adults who, you can think back to your teenage years. If you ever lost trust with your parents, you know just how hard it is to get back. See, here's the thing. When the way we live doesn't reflect the kingdom values of Jesus, we lose the ability to preserve others around us. Because people just look at us and they say, well, you're just a hypocrite. You're just a hypocrite. And so we have to consider how we live. Now, this isn't about being perfect. I don't believe Jesus was calling us to perfection. In fact, if he knew we could be perfect, he never would have come to earth in the first place. This was not about being perfect, but it was about considering how we live and being careful. and about being authentic. And that when we fail, we ask for forgiveness. We're humble. When we mess up, we go and we try to make right whatever it is that we have done wrong. And it's allowing God to work through us to preserve the world around us. And then Jesus, he used another metaphor. And again, I mean, this is probably very familiar to you. It's certainly familiar to me. Here's what he said. He says, you are the light of the world. Now, you may be thinking, I thought Jesus is the light of the world. And there's another place in Scripture where we read Jesus is the light of the world. And we'll get to kind of the confusing nature of that here in just a minute. But he says, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. So you know what the purpose of light is, right? I don't even have to tell you. Why do you turn lights on? So you can see what you couldn't see. You turn them on at night. You turn them on when it's dark out, kind of in the day. I mean, the purpose of light is to illuminate what's not illuminated. You get that. So how do you hide a city on a hill? It's impossible. I mean, how do you hide a city at night when all the lights are shining all around? I mean, it is virtually impossible. Now, when I was a kid growing up, and I went to vacation Bible school, we learned a song that went along with this verse. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it. Nobody, oh, thank you, Amber. You can't see Amber, but she's back there running the computer for us. Yeah, I mean, you know, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Now, you may have thought, because what Jesus is saying here is that the light that we have been given is meant to illuminate others. And you may have thought, well, I thought my faith is private, and I want my faith to be private. But what Jesus was saying is that our lives become a beacon of light to the world around us, that when we take his value system and we begin living it out, it begins illuminating the world around us. And your faith, I'm telling you, it was not meant to be personal. Your faith is meant to be personal, but it was never meant to be private. Your faith is never meant to be private. And when people see you living out your kingdom values and they see your life is different, they recognize there's something behind that. When they see that the way you treat other people as though they have value, when you honor the people around you, when you honor your spouse, and when he's not in the room or when she's not in the room, you build him or her up. You don't tear him down. When you look out for other people, when you look out for the needs of those who are weak and who are helpless, that becomes a beacon of light that cannot be hidden. He continued on, he said this, he says, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. That wouldn't make sense. Instead, they put it on its stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In a day and age without electricity, what would they do? They would take a lamp and they would strategically place it in the center of a home so that the most amount of light could be shed to the most number of people. It was strategic. So let me ask you a question. Is it possible that God, your Father in heaven, has strategically placed you where you are because he wants you to be a light that illuminates the world around you? Now, again, you may say, well, isn't Jesus the light? Yes, Jesus is the light. But I tell you what, it's kind of like the sun and the moon. Over the last couple of months, we've had some really amazing supermoons. And if you go outside at a full moon when it's a supermoon, it doesn't matter that it's dark out and the moon is not emitting any kind of light. It is simply reflecting the light of the sun, and it shines in its brilliance. Now, here's how Jesus finished all this. He says, in the same way as a city on a hill is difficult to cover up, in the same way as you put a lamp on a stand strategically so that it can illuminate the most number of places, in the same way, he says, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds. Not that they would hear your well-formulated arguments, not that they would listen at the eloquence of your speech or your smooth talking, but that they would see your actions, that they would see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. That they would see what you do, that they would watch how you live, and that they would give their attention not to you, but to someone else, to God, your Father in heaven. So here's what Jesus was teaching, that there's a direct relationship between what we do and how other people view God. That how we live is directly connected to others' perception of God. So the question I really believe he was posing to his followers in those moments, the thing that he wanted them to think about, is, are we going to live out those values? Are we going to be merciful when people don't deserve mercy? Are we going to be forgiving when people don't deserve forgiveness? Are we going to show love even when others haven't been loving to us? Will we have humility? Will we have humility even though we're invited to kind of make it all about ourselves? Will we pursue purity in a world of shifting morals, or frankly, even absent morals at times? Will we pursue the things that are part of his kingdom values? And his point is that the way we live our lives matters far more than the words we speak. That doesn't mean our words don't matter. That doesn't mean we never get creative in the way that we communicate. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have good arguments that are ready and prepared, but the way we live is far more important. Essentially saying that your witness to others hinges on what others witness in you. Your witness to others hinges on what others witness in you, which is why street preachers don't exactly have a lot of great track records when it comes to converting people. I don't know if you've ever seen a street preacher before, but pretty much every time I've observed one, I mean, they're screaming, they're shouting, they've got these signs that are so offensive. And I just look at that and I think to myself, are you really letting your light shine? I mean, are you really preserving anything? Are you adding any kind of flavor to this world in a way that wants to move people in the direction of God? Because the way we live is what's going to communicate the God we serve. Years ago, I had the opportunity to meet a guy who was a street evangelist. Now, I want to be really clear, very different from the street preachers that maybe you've seen with the pickets and stuff on the street corners. But this guy, he would go around with Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron. Maybe you've heard of them. They had a show called Way of the Master. Kirk Cameron's from Growing Pains, and a movie Left Behind that I left behind at Blockbuster in the early 2000s. And they go around teaching people how to have evangelistic conversations with people on the road and on the streets. And honestly, much of it's around the lines of trying to get them to admit that they've broken the 10 Commandments and that makes them a liar or an adulterer or whatever else. And so as I was sitting with this gentleman, he had, to the best of my recollection, a briefcase full of these tracts that they would use, and he had really invested a good amount of resources into it. And in some respects, I was kind of in awe of the way that he had so boldly been willing to share his faith and have difficult conversations with people on the streets. And, I was frankly just kind of thinking to myself, man, Seth, you need to pick it up a little bit. You need to be willing to have some more of these difficult conversations, and you need to be willing to, do this. And so I asked him a question, and honestly, my question was not built out of any kind of animosity. I wasn't trying to it wasn't a gotcha sort of question. It truly was a genuine question. And so I looked at him and I just said, that's amazing. I mean, how many people have you had the opportunity to pray with to receive Christ into their lives? And to this day, I tell you what, his answer still astounds me, because I was expecting him to say dozens or hundreds. I mean, all kinds of people. I mean, for Pete's sake, he's going out with Kirk Cameron and Ray Comfort. They're like professionals at this. Do you know what he said to me? He said, none. None, but we have planted a lot of seeds. And I'm not saying he hasn't planted a lot of seeds, and I hope those seeds continue to grow and flourish. But what my experience with him underscored is the importance of what Jesus taught, that saying it isn't enough, that we have to live it, that our lives need to preserve and illuminate the world around us, and that our witness hinges on what others witness in us. And when we live kingdom values out, when they become the markers of our lives in the way that we live, people come and see the God behind them. And our lives point in the direction, not of ourselves. Our lives point in the direction of God. And yeah, we use words at times, and yes, we're creative. But what we say is amplified or discredited by how we live. And it's in our relationships with other people as they see us living out what we claim the people look at that and they say, wow, he's the real deal, or she's the real deal, or wow, I mean, they really are committed to Jesus. They know what they believe and they hold to it. Or they look at us and say, if that's a Christian, I'm not sure I want anything to do with it. Do you know that was the experience of Gandhi, the great Indian leader, the great Hindu Indian leader? Did you know he went to church one time and he showed up at the doors and he was greeted by people who told him that this church is for Europeans only? And so Gandhi walked away from that experience and he thought to himself, if Christianity has caste just like Hinduism, then I'm better off just staying where I am. And it led him to say this thing that I have just been racked with at different times. He says, I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. And think about what was lost. Think about what could have been gained if Gandhi had committed his life to Jesus. But there was a group of men and women who didn't live as though they believed what it was that they taught. So Jesus says you're to preserve and illuminate. You're to preserve the world from decay, and you are to illuminate the world toward my ways. So as we close, I've got to ask you a question. And the question is, what do others witness in you? What do others witness in you? Are they witnessing in your life, preserving and illuminating the world around you? Now again, this isn't about perfection. This isn't about perfection. As I said earlier, Jesus wouldn't have had to come and die if we could be perfect. But this is about authentically living out the things that Jesus taught in a broken world where we do it imperfectly. And it's in the midst of our perfection or our imperfection rather, that we experience God's incredible grace. The Apostle Paul, when he talked about his imperfections, he talked about how Jesus spoke to him and said, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. So be honest with yourself and answer that question. What do others witness in you? What do they witness in you? What do they see? Are you preserving and illuminating? When God pricks your conscience, because it happens to all of us. I know I'm a professional Christian, but there are times where I'm thinking about something or talking with somebody and God just pricks my conscience with the way I've treated somebody else or things that I've said or the way I've gossiped or whatever else. And he pricks my conscience. And that is an opportunity for us to respond and to listen and to move in his direction and to receive his forgiveness and to keep striving forward. My guess is you know an imperfect person who has lived as salt and light in your life. And you've watched the way they lived, you've seen the way they've lived out their values, and they've done it imperfectly, but they've gone and they've sought restitution when they've wronged someone. They've gone back and corrected. They've been asking for forgiveness. Their lives were marked by humility. And you look at them and you just think, wow, I want that. I want that for me. And aren't you thankful you've known them? Aren't you thankful that you've seen somebody living that out? Because salt preserves. It keeps things from decay. And light illuminates, and it points us in the direction of Jesus. And so the invitation for us is to live in such a way that others want to come and see. So are you doing that? What do others witness in you? I want to invite you to ask yourself that question in the coming week. What do others witness in me? And maybe there's something in your life that needs to move in the direction of God's grace and his mercy, and you need to surrender it and give it over to God. And when he gives that to you and when he illuminates that in your life, would you be willing to do so and move in his direction? And as you do, you will continue preserving and illuminating the world around you, and God will allow you to help others come and see and know and experience a God who loves them so much. So let's be that. Let's be the church that invites people to come and see. Let me pray for us. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for these words that Jesus spoke that were so countercultural to the world that he lived in. And frankly, in many respects, are countercultural to the world that we live in today. God, I thank you for the values of his kingdom that he brought onto this earth, that his ways of relating to others and living life, they are so different and yet they are so life giving, as he invited people to come and experience life to the full, abundant life. God, as I've seen others experience that, as I have experienced it personally, would you help us to live in a way that points others in your direction, that we're salty, that we preserve, that we illuminate, that we're light, and that in doing so, what others witness in us helps others to see you. As we strive to be a church that invites others to come and see, would you help us? Would you help us? Thank you for this time, God. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Hey, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a powerful just reminder to us to be constantly aware and just be thinking about that this week. I know I will be, about what is it that others witness when they experience my life. And so we just want to encourage you in that. And we also want to invite you back next week for week 3 in our series, Come and See. Have a great week.